Kingdom of Men, Sister Worlds, Book 1. Written and read by Tiffany Nicole Terry. 1. Phantom Dragon. KaLeah took a slow, silent breath and docked her arrow, pointing her nose in the direction of the sound. After a long day of hunting for big game without luck, she was glad to have finally locked onto an easy shot. She could tell from the grunting and shuffling sounds that it was big, but she didn't care. KaLeah had carried home large forest beasts before, and she wasn't afraid of a little exercise. KaLeah stalked closer to the sounds, coming from a clearing up ahead. She knew the woods well and could picture the grassy clearing. She moved carefully through the thick forest foliage, using only her hearing to guide her to her target. It was rare for animals to make so much noise, but she assumed it was most likely injured. Since it was in the clearing, it would be a quick shot straight to the heart, wrap it up with some vines, and then home before dark. She readied her bow, took one step toward the edge of the trees, and froze. Crouched in the clearing, beyond her, was a monster with glistening emerald scales. It gracefully lifted its long, slender neck and turned its jet-black eyes to hers. Every muscle ached to run, but KaLeah couldn't connect the thoughts to the motion. Her eyes widened to take in the creature's massive body and muscular arms as it rose higher on its back legs. She saw the beast's muscular arms ended in long black talons, were coated in grass and clumps of mud. It had thin, dagger-like spikes along the side of its green, scaly head. The long, pointed snout was shut, but revealed sharp teeth poking out through each side. A bead of sweat started to roll down the side of KaLeah's head. The creature blew a chunk of mud from its snout. The noise was so sudden, KaLeah jolted and released the arrow she'd been holding tightly docked. It flew and hit the beast right in the chest, bouncing off its scales and landing on the ground. She quickly jerked herself back and dove behind the nearest tree, dropping her bow to the ground. Her breath came heavy and uneven as she tried to keep from making any noise. "Is that a dragon?" she asked herself. "That cannot be a dragon. Dragons are extinct. I'm dreaming. I must have fallen along the path and hit my head on a rock." KaLeah made an involuntary whimper, knowing she was most certainly not dreaming. Most of the animals on Naldash had evolved from dragons, but dragons themselves had been extinct for many lifetimes. She clenched her eyelids shut and reminded herself to breathe. Her father had taught her in any sort of panic-inducing situation, she must keep breathing steadily to keep her mind clear. A clear mind is more likely to survive in any situation. But how do I survive a non-existent dragon? Is it a ghost? A phantom? She took another deep breath, smoothed a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear, and then cautiously leaned out around the tree trunk for another view. The monstrous beast was still standing there in the small clearing. Its long neck trailed down to a spine-lined back, past a set of silvery, transparent wings, and ended in a tail. It beat open the two wings, stirring up the dirt around it, then pulled them back close to its body and continued digging furiously at a small hill in the middle of the clearing. KaLeah tilted her head curiously, realizing the sound she had followed was the sound of the dragon clawing into the ground. It had seen her and yet was much more interested in what it was doing. Is it trying to get at an animal or digging out a burrow? Did dragons even live in burrows? She shook her head violently. What was she thinking? Dragons are not real. "This is crazy," she said to herself. She realized it didn't matter what it was or what it was doing. It was still a dangerous-looking, beast-like creature mere steps away. "I need to get away, now. I'll grab my bow and quickly head back through the thicker part of the woods, where it will be too big to follow. Unless I can break trees, of course." KaLeah visualized the plan in her head, building up the courage to move. She began to prepare for a stealthy escape through the woods, bending first to reclaim her bow when... Wait. She froze mid-bend. fingers on the bow. She had heard the word as if placed inside her mind. Wait. Again, the word penetrated her mind, moving her own thoughts aside. Had the dragon just spoken to her? She formed the question in her mind. Are you talking to me? Yes. This isn't happening, she told herself. But she couldn't resist. Are you real? Are you a dragon? Yes. KaLeah knew she needed to run. Look. I must be crazy, she thought as she peeked back around the tree trunk. The dragon tore away a large section of mud with its claws, roots dangling in the air, and tossed the clump aside. With its other claw, it smoothed away more mud to reveal something shimmering beneath the mound. Look. KaLeah was still quite a distance away from the dragon, and she could only catch a slight reflection of light on the spot the dragon had cleared away. Regardless of whether it was her imagination or a real flesh-eating dragon, she wasn't about to step 1 foot out from the security of the dense forest. As if sensing her fear, or hearing it in her mind, the dragon expanded its wings and began to lift itself into the sky, one slow beat of its silvery, translucent wings at a time. She watched the emerald creature gleam in the sunlight as it passed across the dead planet hanging in the sky. The dragon eclipsed the dark sphere called Denlarak, rising in the late afternoon sky, and then disappeared beyond her sight. KaLeah pressed herself against the tree and held perfectly still, her breathing shallow, listening for any hint that the dragon was returning. Long moments passed, and her back started to ache from holding herself steady against the hard bark. I should go home, she said to herself, but she knew she had just seen and experienced something important. Either dragons still existed in hiding, or their ghosts were around and strong enough to impact the physical world. It had spoken to her. It had called to her. When she was sure it wasn't coming back, and with her curiosity getting the better of her, she left the safety of the thick wood and walked out cautiously into the clearing. She took soft steps across the grass, looking up, around, and listened intently to the forest sounds. She walked up a slight incline, leading toward a large mound in the center of the clearing. When she reached the spot where the dragon had been digging, she leaned closer and brushed away more mud, clinging to an object beneath. There was something hard, smooth, and cool to the touch just beneath the large mound of caked dirt. It seemed to be almost shaped like a boulder, but it was abnormally smooth and there were no grooves. She pulled out her dagger and began to tear the clumps of dirt and grass around the edge, cutting and pulling off sections where the roots had tried to take hold. She worked until the sky began to darken. It wasn't entirely uncovered, but what she had revealed resembled a sphere, which had been slightly pressed down upon from the top. The material was as hard as iron, black as a moonless night, and half the size of her two-bedroom house. She had no explanation for it or for the dragon that had appeared to her. She stood in wonder and noticed she could make out her own image quite well, similar to her reflection on the surface of water or glass. The object mirrored her curious gaze, her stormy blue eyes, ivory skin, and dark brown hair right back at her. KaLeah stretched out her hand and ran it along the black surface. The object responded to her touch, and she jerked her hand back quickly. Rows of lights began to appear, flashing different colors at seemingly random intervals. This is some sort of craft, KaLeah realized intuitively. It was a metallic craft that had no name on her planet. The longer she stood in its now living presence, the more nervous she became. The sun was setting, and she didn't want to be here with the strange thing in the dark. She grabbed her bow and arrows and slowly backed away, watching the lights trace patterns along the black reflective surface. KaLeah turned and ran back through the woods, her long legs making fast work of the journey. She knew the woods and the trails well enough to soar through, even in the faintest of light. She'd been to the clearing with the grassy mound hundreds of times throughout her childhood, but she'd never given it much thought. She'd scouted around it and perhaps climbed it a time or two, but only to gain the upper ground on whatever she was hunting. She felt completely dumbfounded that a mysterious object had been hidden beneath the dirt for her entire life. She burst from the edge of the forest and headed for the hut she shared with her father. It was the one he had built close to the trees and far from the center of the village. Over the years, the village had grown, and so had the huts that encroached upon their own. It soured her father to no end. He spoke often of building a new one in the middle of the forest where the village could not reach. Her father was the wisest person she knew. The village children feared the large and stoically silent man who had trained her to fight and hunt, although girls were never supposed to learn these things. Not even the boys knew how to fight, stalk prey, and then skin it for proper cooking as well as she did. KaLeah had been doing things at 6 that most boys learned at 10. All the children regarded her as an odd thing because of this, and yet she cherished the time her father spent teaching her. His congratulations on a good kill was the only affection she ever received. The village girls would sit together and braid each other's dark black hair into long, elaborate designs. KaLeah stood out with her unkempt brown hair that would show hues of red or golden depending on the time of day and how heavily the sun was shining on her. She had strong cheekbones, a petite nose, and stormy blue almond-shaped eyes. She would tan deeply in the summer sun, matching the skin tone of the villagers, but lose the tan every winter. She was the only one in the village who didn't have brown eyes. When she was younger, the girls would sneak up on her and pull strands of her hair out, running off as if they had slayed a dragon or stolen its treasure. They regarded her as some wild animal in pants, where they were groomed and dressed in proper dresses. Once she learned how to punch, they stopped trying to pull her hair out. The girls in the village had never been friendly, and so eventually she accepted the distance and focused on learning all she could from her father. Young girls her age were supposed to focus only on which boys they were going to wed, while they learned skills like mending fabrics, cooking, and cleaning. She had learned how to do all the same chores as the girls, but without a mother around to encourage her to be more feminine, she didn't see the need. She wasn't interested in the conversations the young girls in the village were having. She would rather spar with the boys than figure out if she could tolerate one long enough to wed someday. The girls mostly saw her as a dirty boy, while the boys saw her as a strange and unkempt girl who was better than them at swordplay and archery. They had grown tired of teasing her and eventually knew by fighting with her they may lose, but at least they would learn a new trick or two. Their tolerant acceptance made the girls like her even less, and the adults disapproved, but dared not say anything to her father. Most days, she was proud to be so strong, fast, and skilled at combat, but loneliness carved scars into her heart. Some days, when she watched the other children playing, laughing, and holding hands, her heart ached in isolation. She reminded herself that the thing missing in her life was the loving embrace of a mother after a long day of hunting, someone to help remove her shoes and wash her face and hands before dinner. She knew what other mothers did for their children. She watched other families and saw fathers were mostly aloof and unaffectionate. Her father was only playing his part accordingly. He wasn't supposed to figure out how to play the mother role as well. And so she would sigh away her feelings as being nothing but childish. She knew she was lucky to have a father who was so capable, who had been willing to teach her all he knew from such a young age. She could survive completely on her own in the middle of the woods thanks to him. Come what may, he had created a survivor, and she intended to put those skills to use someday. But not today. Today, she needed his wisdom. Her father knew the woods better than she did. He would either immediately be able to explain the black glittering object buried under a mound of dirt, or she would take him back to see it, and he would know for sure then. Since dragons were supposed to be extinct, she decided she would leave that little bit of information out of the story for now, as she reached the front door. She had a feeling he would dismiss the entire story if he knew she had been led into the clearing by a phantom dragon. Their home was similar to the others in the village, small, built with interlocking pieces of wood that had been sealed with dried mud, and a thatched roof on top of it all. Theirs was cozy, with a large kitchen and two straw stuffed chairs in front of an iron stove used for cooking and heating. Furs were draped over the chairs, and woven rugs covered the wood floors. When she opened the door, she was greeted with warmth and the smell of cooked Durlin meat mixed with pipe smoke. The warmth was too much for her, and she immediately began shedding her coat and boots. The run home had left her breathless, and nerves were starting to clench her stomach. Her father was sitting near the fire, smoking a pipe. He was not the type to offer greetings, pleasantries, or smiles. He just sat with his brown eyes on his daughter. His skin was sun-worn, and his face was covered in a thick brown beard. "Where's your kill?" he asked, looking her over. Her hands and forearms were still covered in mud, and she was sure she'd rubbed her face during her trek home. She looked more like a child who had spent all day playing in the dirt, and not the hunter he had sent out earlier that morning. "I'm sorry, Father, but I didn't have a good hunt today. Something happened out in the woods." She went to sit on the chair opposite him, and he lowered his pipe in interest. "I saw—" She started and then stopped, remembering her decision to keep the phantom dragon out of the story. "I found something sticking out of the ground in a clearing. You know the clearing toward the north with a large grassy hill in the middle? I saw something shining beneath it, and I started digging. I know it sounds silly, but there was something beneath the hill. It was solid, like a knife blade, but shiny black. And when I hit it, it made a sort of echoing noise or a hollow sound." KaLeah jumped up and, with a closed fist, rapped her knuckles against the kettle hanging above the fireplace. "Like this. But it wasn't this dingy. It was shiny and beautiful. And then lights, like firebugs or lamp lights, just started twinkling all throughout the surface. It was glorious, Father. What could it be?" Her father turned his face to watch the flames, a brief look of concern crossing over his features before flashing away. After a long pause, he asked, "Why would you waste valuable hunting time digging around in the ground? You know we need to eat, KaLeah." "I was distracted," she said. She knew immediately he was irritated and was glad she hadn't mentioned the dragon. He would have accused her of making up childish stories instead of working. "I wanted to know what it was in case it was something of value," she said, trying to defend herself. "If we can't eat it, then it's nothing of value to us." His voice started to rise, and she looked down at her dirty hands shamefully, absently flicking the mud from underneath her fingernails. He pushed himself heavily up from the chair and headed for the door. She watched him grab his coat, boots, his bow, and a quiver of arrows from beside the door, not once daring to ask him what he was doing. He opened the door and called back to her as he started to leave. "You should have stayed on the path." Then he left, closing the door behind him. KaLeah waited for a few breaths before jumping up and running to peek out of the window. She looked toward the village center, but seeing nothing, turned just to catch him disappearing into the woods. They had enough food to last at least another day or two, and they could easily trade wares for extra meat in the village if necessary. She assumed it was his anger that drove him to go hunting this late, perhaps to prove a point. She felt terrible for letting him down, and a small ache filled her chest. She went to the kitchen to scrub her hands in the basin, and then grabbed a couple slices of bread to toast over the fire while she ate the meat her father had left out. After eating, she washed the dirt off her arms and face and changed out of her hunting clothes. She slipped into a long sleeping shirt, then ran her hands through her hair to clear out any leaves of dirt. Her bedroom was large enough for a small bed and a chest of drawers. She crawled under the layers of animal fur and fell asleep quickly, still seeing the phantom dragon in her mind. The next morning, KaLeah woke up to find her father had not yet returned. Or perhaps he'd come home to collect his things for market and then left again before she'd woken. If he'd brought home any game, he would have taken it to the cellar for her to clean. She dressed in a fresh pair of brown pants and a loose-fitting green shirt. KaLeah had gotten used to dressing like a boy. She was comfortable that way. Out in the living area, she lifted the corner of her rug to reveal the door to the cellar. She pulled on the latch and lifted the door, then lit the candle they kept on the ledge beside the stairs. The cellar was half the size of the house above, dug out of the earth to maintain the moisture and coolness the dirt provided. It kept their meat fresh longer and was a good place to hide the valuables her father would take to market to trade or sell. She used her candle to light a few lanterns. There was no fresh game waiting for her on the ceiling hook in the center of the cellar. She also didn't see the quiver of arrows he took with him when he'd left the night before. The stack of market furs was still lying in the corner, along with some newer arrows and knives they had made. There went her theory that he had taken some furs, arrows, and knives to sell at the market. So now what? She wondered. She could go out hunting again, but if her father was still out hunting, they might end up with more meat than they could sell. Her father did not like wasting food. One large durlin was enough to last them for many days, and any more than that, they would trade for goods in the town. She looked at the empty sacks beside the shelves that ran along the back wall. There were some jars containing jams and pickles and other items they'd grown and stored, but they hadn't yet begun to dig up the potatoes. She supposed her father might get over his anger quicker if she began that grueling chore without his instruction. KaLeah walked to the shelves to grab a couple of the empty potato sacks. She pulled at one, and some jars that had been stacked on top of the corner began to spiral. She moved quickly to catch them, but one slipped and exploded in the hard dirt, sending red jam across the floor. "Oh, great," she said. One more thing for her father to be upset about. Maybe he wouldn't notice one missing jar. She adjusted the jars on the shelf so they were no longer resting on any potato sacks, and then grabbed a thick cloth to clean her mess. The jam was starting to soak into the ground, and she knew she wouldn't be able to hide the evidence of the mess. She carefully picked up the glass and then began to rub soapy water onto the red-stained dirt, realizing how ridiculous it was to try to clean a mess off of a dirt floor. As she rubbed, she started to see something that wasn't dirt underneath her strokes. Curious, she scrubbed harder and poured more water onto the area until she cleared away enough dirt to reveal a small trap door, half the size of the one leading to the cellar. "What is this?" she wondered out loud. Instead of a latch, there was a hole in one of the boards. She stuck her finger through it and pulled up. The door didn't open easily, and she had to clear more caked mud away from the edges before it finally lifted. She lowered one of the lanterns into the dark hole, expecting to see shiny pieces of silver or gold glittering back like some lost treasure. Instead, the light hit the edges of something reflective that didn't shimmer. KaLeah pulled back the lantern, set it down beside her, and reached into the hole with both hands. Her fingers touched something hard and cold. She lifted out a bulky black object and set it beside her. She had never seen anything like it. It was a shiny metal object with a long cylinder-shaped section as long as her forearm. On one side, there was what seemed to be an awkwardly shaped handle, more for holding than lifting. She gripped the handle, and although it was a fit for a hand, she could tell it was for larger hands than hers. She lifted it up, pointing the end of the cylinder away from her, and peered through a tiny triangle sight, feeling familiarity. "This is how I aim my arrows," she realized. Her finger came into contact with a switch of some kind. When she pulled her finger toward her, the object made a hollow click. She set it down beside her and stared at it for some time before going back into the cubbyhole. She retrieved 4 more objects that looked like the first, but of varying sizes. Then she pulled out a contraption that looked like 3 belts woven together with multiple buckles. She tossed it aside with the other items and then pulled out the final object, a black box with 2 clasps. Once she had unearthed all the mysterious treasures, she started to lift each one. Her instincts told her that they were weapons of some sort, but unlike anything she'd ever seen. She opened the black box and found a neat row of black blocks. Lifting one, she saw each rectangular block contained thousands of tiny beads. The beads were yellow, and when she pressed her finger to them, they were hot to the touch. This is all dangerous, she realized. Not knowing what any of it was or how any of it worked, she was sure anything kept underground that felt hot to the touch couldn't be safe. Also, her father wouldn't have kept this stuff hidden if it wasn't dangerous. He taught her how to use every kind of weapon on Naldash, how to hunt every kind of beast, and how to survive in the forest. To not teach her about this meant they must be even more dangerous than all the other weapons, beasts, and forest on the planet combined. She gently placed them back into the hole, closed the trap door, and covered the door with dirt, using some of the water to help it harden as if it had never been disturbed. She sat back on the dirt and stared at the floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. She and her father didn't talk much, but it was still odd for him to keep something like this a secret. She had seen men carrying the usual bows, spears, axes, and other weapons and hunting tools through the village, but had never seen items such as these. The weapons in the ground appeared to be made from the same metal as the large object buried in the woods. They had weapons made of gray steel, and her arrowheads were made from a gray granite rock they mined in the mountains. But this black metal was too perfect and smooth to be natural. Is this related to the craft I found? She wondered. Her father had been irritated, but perhaps he wasn't irritated about the lack of food at all. What if he knows something about the object in the woods? What if that is where he went? She took the potato sacks from the ground and put out the lanterns. She spent the day digging up potatoes in the garden, looking out toward the woods again and again. Once that chore was completed, she stayed in the house and tried to busy herself with cleaning while she waited for her father to come home. Days passed. She ventured out into the village to ask if any of the traders had come across her father on the roads or if any hunters had seen evidence of him in the woods. No one had seen or heard from her father in days. With each passing moment, she grew more curious and more anxious. Her father may not be affectionate, but he was all KaLeah had, and she was starting to worry. Something could have happened to him, she realized one afternoon. She decided the time to sit around and wait was gone. She packed a bag with food and water, grabbed arrows, her bow, sword, and a couple of daggers. She dressed in layers, prepared to sleep outside, and then closed up the house. She informed a few of the villagers that her father was missing and she would be traveling to find him. She asked the men who routinely traveled the roads between towns to keep a lookout for him. They all scrutinized her, a few mentioning how unheard of, dangerous, and even scandalous it was of her to be traveling alone. And yet, none of them offered to go in her place. Her father had not exactly made friends with the villagers over the years. She assumed it had to do with his past, but she had never asked. KaLeah set off into the woods, taking the familiar paths. She would return to the clearing where she saw the phantom dragon first, and if she saw no signs of him, she would continue searching. She looked for any indication of her father along the way, tracking him as she would any other beast. She looked for tracks, broken branches, and signs of a camp, or moss that had been cleared from a log or rock. However, after hours of searching, she found nothing. She located the spot where the dragon had led her off her usual path and went in the direction of the mound. She moved quickly and quietly, using her memory to guide her back to that place. When she found the clearing, she checked for signs that a dragon or another human had been there. Instantly, she noticed something odd about the mound. It was no longer a mound. She walked closer and saw that the large object had been completely extracted from the dirt and was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a large circular crater. Had her father come to dig it up? Had it been light enough for him to move? Or what if the dragon had come back and carried it to another location? What if her father had been surprised by the dragon and eaten? She shook her head back and forth, refusing to believe her father was no longer living. It wasn't a possibility. He was too strong and too smart. Besides, she thought, the dragon hadn't made any attempt to harm her, and the more time that passed, the more she questioned if she had seen or simply imagined the beast. She was disappointed the mystery object was gone. She would now never know what it was or why it was here in the middle of the woods behind her village. She was even more disappointed that her father wasn't here. It meant she had to keep looking, and she would have to travel further from the village than she'd ever been. Arion was the northernmost village in Bellarone Kingdom, the mountains to the north being impassable. Some people visited from other nearby villages to trade goods, and sometimes people left to move to other areas of the kingdom, but for the most part, everyone she knew stayed in Arion. She sat on a large stone and thought for a while about which direction to resume her search. Many types of men traveled the roads between villages to sell and trade, so if they were looking out for her father there, she needn't also travel the roads or search out the nearby villages. Another issue with traveling the roads was that KaLeah never actually had heard of women traveling alone. Perhaps if a family was relocating to work farms, they would travel together in a carriage. But it was completely unheard of for girls or women to travel without male escorts. Someone could try to scoop her up and drag her back to Arion, or worse, try to take her back to their village as a wife. No one was fighting to marry her in Arion, so she was safe there. But she would not be protected if she were caught while wandering the kingdom alone. As far as other men were concerned, without an escort, she was fair game. She would be strong willed and skilled enough to fight off one captor, but not too many more if they were to gang up on her. At the absolute worst, if she proved to be disobedient or discourteous about marriage, she would be taken to the comfort house to appease the appetite of traveling men. KaLeah would have rather died. Traveling through the woods and staying hidden was the best option. The men of her village hunted the same woods, but she could easily avoid them. There were mountains to the north, and then the sea beyond, but no villages, and no reason for her father to have traveled north. If her father had gone west, then he would run into men from her village who routinely fished the river there. They would surely inform him of her search. And if her father had gone to the east, the men who traveled regularly to trade with the farmers there would come across him. Since the forest thinned out to both the east and west, if her father had traveled in either direction, he would eventually be met. Everyone else would take the road south to the Bellarone Castle markets, the most populated area of the kingdom. The woods that surrounded her village also stretched down south toward the main center. Though it wasn't technically the center of Bellarone Kingdom, people referred to it as such. If her father had traveled that way, it would be the only path he could take unseen for days until he reached the Bellarone Center. So, she set her course. She would head south toward the Bellarone Castle in the center of Bellarone Kingdom. She would travel through the forests, stay off the roads, and keep searching for any sign of her father. She traveled for days, resting only to eat the small game she killed along the way with any edible plants she managed to gather. Plenty of streams ran through the forest from the mountains above Arion, so she never ran short of water. She took only short naps when she found a turned-over log or a circle of pines to hide in. As for her father, there had been no signs. In fact, she hadn't seen any sign of hunters or other travelers in the woods until she happened upon what appeared to be a deserted camp. Some rocks had been circled as if to create a fire, but no fire had been set. Some of the area had been cleared, and a few piles of leaves and thick branches were stacked in a bundle, but she hadn't seen or heard anyone nearby. She decided to make use of the prepared space and sat down her pack. Suddenly, she heard a rustling coming from the brush behind her. She froze, knowing instantly she had made a mistake. KaLeah drew her sword and spun, turning to face the loud, unsettling rustling sound coming from the brush behind her. Even stranger, she thought she heard a low growling sound and thought Dogers could be nearby. She had never had to fight off the sharp-toothed, four-legged creatures and wondered if her time had finally come after years of being able to avoid them in the wild. Instead of furry beasts, three large men emerged from the thick forest and stepped into the prepared campground. The one at the front raised a thick lip over missing teeth. "What do we have here?" he said with a sneer.